I want to go a little bit deeper with you into genetic entropy and the increase in genetic entropy that we've had over the last 6,000 years, and how that contradicts something as basic as the second law of thermodynamics. And I know people are like, okay, wait a minute here, you're losing me. But we're going to simplify this. We're going to translate this into simple fifth grade language so everybody can understand. And then let's just determine what makes the most logical sense when we look at what's been happening to humanity genetically. Does it make more sense that God created us perfect 6,000 years ago and we've been slowly decaying genetically? Or does it make more sense that we've been increasing in genetic strength and design and capability and everything else? Have we been going against the grain? Have we been running up the down escalator or not? So we'll dive into that coming up next. Grady, I know you and I have talked about this before. We've talked about it on the show before, but I think it's time for maybe a little bit of a primer for our audience as it relates to genetic entropy. Because there are some, as you said early on, we're all looking at the same evidence. Creationists and evolutionists, all right? Christians and atheists are all looking at the very same evidence. The question is, what conclusions are we drawing from that evidence? And so genetic entropy is a perfect example of this. Now, sometimes people get confused. They even hear a word like entropy and they don't know what that means. And I think, well, if you're increasing entropy, doesn't mean you're building. No, actually, increasing entropy is a decaying or degrading of something. When you increase, so entropy is the decline or decay of something. So you're increasing the decay or the breakdown of it. So I don't want people to get confused if you hear them talking about increasing entropy. But help us understand this genetically, what the evolutionary perspective is about what's been happening with humans genetically, supposedly, compared to what the biblical perspective of what's been happening to humans since Adam and Eve and what we can glean from that.
Well, the word entropy actually is the measurement of the loss of information or energy in a system over time. And in genetics, what we do is we copy the previously existing information. You copy mama and papa, and you pass that information on into the next generation in a combination, which ends up being you. Now, when you copy something, you have only two choices. You can copy it either perfectly, in which case there is no change,
right?
Or you can copy it imperfectly, in which case it always goes downhill.
Right.
Now, evolutionists believe, by faith, it's a religion, that mutations, which is the only random chance event occurring in nature that does cause genetic change of information, that mutations, which are copying errors, will be beneficial. Well, anybody who knows anything about, for instance, called information theory, applied to genetics, of course, is that you always lose something. You know, if I were in a room with 10 people, and I told the first one a story for 5 minutes that nobody else could hear. I then asked them verbatim to repeat the story exactly as I told them to the next person and on to the 10th person. When I asked the 10th person to tell me the story I told the first person, you and I know it's not even going to be in the same country I started with.
Right.
And so what's happened? We have mutations, copying errors from one person to the next in the story.
Right.
And what happens is the story gets worse over time.
Right.
So the same thing, and as information theory applies to genetics, that as we copy the genetic information, it will decay in the sense that the mutations lose previously existing information. They scramble it up, they lose it, they destroy it, they corrupt it. And over time, these errors are not corrected by random chance. They stay. Now, we know from the Human Genome Project, completed in April of 2003, that today we are losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation. So I love my grandchildren, but they have 2 to 4% less genetic information in their bodies than I do. And if you go back in time, your great-grandparents were individually more intelligent, had faster reaction times than today, and we know that by measurements. And so we are decaying rapidly. So that's the opposite of what evolutionists would claim.
Now, let me stop you for just a second here, okay? Because I want you to complete that point, but I want to pause very briefly and interject something. And it really backs up what you're saying here. Even if you go back just a couple generations, let alone a few generations ago, raw brain power was a lot stronger than it is now. Even though we have this idea, this notion that somehow we're smarter now because we have technology, but technology is really just a mask. It's kind of a mask and a Band-Aid to give the false appearance of increased knowledge, but we really don't have it. If anything else, it's making our brains lazier, I would argue. But one of the things that stands out to me, Grady, is that if you try to have a conversation with somebody right now, just in a regular conversation, you want that person to follow you. If I start a sentence and then I give a few examples of what I began with, and then I conclude my point on the back end of it, your average person today is not able to follow along with that. In other words, if I say something like the people of the world today that you have in so many different nations, and this type of, and I go through a whole bunch of descriptions of them, and then I finish my point of the people of today, are wealthier than they were, whatever. Okay, all that stuff I talked about in the middle, I basically caused them to get distracted, and so the way you have to do it today, and I know this is a professional communicator. When you're communicating with people, you have to take point A, and then the conclusion to point A, you have to put them closer together. You can't have too much talking in between your entrance point and your conclusion point, or else the people won't know to bring the two of them together. Go back and read any writings from people in the 1800s, let alone the 1700s. And it is very common to do stuff like that. Even our own country's proclamations and such. Whereas the people of the United States, and then they rattle off 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 paragraphs of whereases. Then they finish the first sentence. People's brains just a couple of hundred years ago could grasp and follow conversations better than they can grasp and follow now. You can't even get somebody to remember your phone number if you tell it to them once. You have to tell it to them 3 times, and then you have to tell them the first 3 numbers, then the last 4 numbers. So it does seem like this is changing a lot and changing in fairly rapid time in just a few short generations.
I think that's an excellent example. And for instance, I would say, read the writings of Thomas Jefferson.
Right, exactly.
George Washington. Any of the founding
You'll have
fathers.
Trouble following along.
Well, I don't.
Well,
you don't.
I get what you're saying.
But,
right. Your average person's going to have trouble following along.
But because of evolution being the dominant teaching in the public schools and universities and so forth, we see the dumbing down of people. Again, the lack of attention, that they're distracted very easily, etc. And they don't follow it. These long sentences that were constructed in wonderful prose 100, 200 years ago.
Right.
How many can even follow the Gettysburg Address?
I know.
All 4 minutes of it.
And that's only a couple of hundred years ago, let alone over the course of the last few thousand years.
So and again, you see the question. What we see today, it's the same thing, creationists, evolutionists. But the evolutionist believes by faith that things get bigger, better, faster, smarter by random chance. They have a God, but the God's name is random chance. That this has to be totally without any kind of creator, designer, outside intelligence of any kind. And yet what we see obviously in nature is this long-term decay. Now, 6,000 years ago, it started with sin in the garden as we would look at it. But even if you don't believe that, we can see that genetically we used to be bigger, better, faster, stronger in the past, and we're becoming smaller, slower, and dumber in the present.
Right.
And it takes no great genius to see that. And that's because, again, we started perfect and we're in a process of decay, whereas they would say we started in decay and became, somehow or another, perfect.
Right. So 3 million years ago, we were still tree-swinging Australopithecine monkeys, and somehow we have managed to increase our brain power over the last few million years. But now that we have the laboratories and the scientists and the cameras rolling and the genetic research, we can now measure that we're declining and degrading. So we're supposed to believe we did exactly the opposite until we start measuring it. Then we've gone in the other direction.
And there's some other aspects to that as well. I hope we can take them
we
on
will
to discuss.
Because I want to talk about things like how how could they have built the pyramids without computers back then? How did they get that kind of precision and lining up with, astronomical, markers in the sky? And how could they do that without computers and such? So let's talk about how smart Adam was, and then relatively how smart Noah was, and then at the time of the Tower of Babel, and by the time Ephraim gets to Egypt, and then basically during the Egyptians and what their brain power was, and this declining that took place. And I'll tell you what, it's really illuminating.